The lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel gleamed like a palace carved from light itself, where marble floors stretched endlessly beneath chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls of crystal and gold. Every surface reflected wealth: the polished stone, the gilded frames holding abstract art worth more than homes, the leather sofas where guests sat with the casual confidence of those who belonged. Outside, luxury cars pulled up in an endless parade: sleek black sedans, sports cars that purred like sleeping panthers, SUVs with tinted windows that hid the faces of the powerful. Doormen in crisp uniforms opened doors with practiced grace, their white gloves never leaving a fingerprint, their smiles professional and distant. Inside, the air itself seemed expensive, climate-controlled to perfection, scented with something floral and exotic, humming with the low murmur of voices that never needed to be raised because money had long ago taught them the power of quiet authority. Women moved through this space like swans gliding across still water, their designer heels clicking rhythms of prosperity against the marble, their jewelry catching light with every gesture, their laughter soft and knowing. Men in tailored suits stood in clusters, discussing deals and mergers and opportunities, their watches worth more than yearly salaries, their handshakes sealing agreements that would move markets. This was a temple to success, a sanctuary for those who had climbed or been born atop the mountain, and everyone who entered understood the unspoken rules. Look like you belong. Act like you deserve it. Never question whether you're worthy, because doubt is the only poverty that shows. But in the center of all this curated perfection, surrounded by people who wore their wealth like armor, stood a woman who did not belong. At least, that's what the hotel manager believed. As his eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened, and his hand reached out to grab her. Her name was Amara, and she stood trembling in that golden lobby, with tears threatening to spill from eyes that had seen too much injustice in too short a time. She wore a simple dress, not dirty, not torn, but humble in a way that screamed its origins to anyone trained to notice such things. The fabric was cotton, not silk. The cut was modest, not designer. Her shoes were worn at the heels from walking rather than driving, from climbing stairs rather than riding elevators, from a life that required movement and effort, and the kind of practical choices that people in this lobby never had to make. Her hair, usually gathered carefully in a bun that spoke of dignity and care, now hung loose where the manager's fingers had tangled in it, pulling hard enough to make her gasp, hard enough to tilt her head back and expose her throat like a trapped animal. Around them, phones appeared like predatory eyes, guests lifting their devices to record, to capture, to witness this moment of degradation with the detached fascination of people watching a car crash from a safe distance. Some faces showed pity, soft and useless. Others showed disgust, but not at the manager. No, their contempt was directed at her, at this woman who had dared to walk into their sanctuary, without the proper costume, without the accepted symbols, without the invisible ticket that wealth provides. The manager's voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, sharp with the authority of someone defending territory he believed was his to protect. "You don't just walk into a place like this," he hissed, and each word carried the weight of 1,000 assumptions about who deserved luxury and who deserved scorn. This hotel is for guests, paying guests, not people like you. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, like poison, like a verdict delivered without trial. People like you. The words were careful, calculated to wound without crossing into territory that could be called illegal. But everyone understood their meaning. Amara's breath came in short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the crushing weight of humiliation. She had come to this hotel with purpose, with a reservation that proved her right to be here, with a garment bag containing an evening gown for the gala she'd been invited to attend. But none of that mattered now, because the manager had looked at her and decided, in the space of a heartbeat, in the instant it took for his eyes to travel from her face to her shoes, that she was an intruder, a pretender, someone who needed to be removed before her presence contaminated the carefully maintained illusion that only certain people deserved beautiful things. She tried to speak, to explain, to show him the confirmation on her phone, but her voice came out small and broken, a whisper swallowed by the vast space and the collective silence of witnesses who watched but did nothing. "Please," she managed, and even that single word felt like surrender. "You don't understand." But the manager's hand tightened in her hair, cutting off her words, cutting off her dignity, reducing her to an object to be handled and removed, like trash that had blown in through an open door. Security guards approached with measured steps, their faces blank and professional, trained not to question their superiors, trained not to see the humanity in the person they'd been called to evict. Amara closed her eyes against the tears, because crying would only confirm what these people already believed, that she was weak, that she didn't belong, that her presence here was a mistake that needed correction. Her heart hammered so hard, she thought it might crack her ribs from the inside, and shame burned through her chest, like acid, even though she had done nothing wrong, even though every fiber of her being knew this was injustice, because cruelty has the power to make its victims feel guilty for being hurt. But then a voice cut through the lobby like a blade through silk, deep, calm, carrying the kind of power that doesn't need volume to command attention. "Remove your hand from my wife, now." The words were not shouted, but spoken with such controlled intensity that they seemed to vibrate in the air, to settle into the bones of everyone who heard them. The lobby fell silent, in a way that was almost violent, conversations cutting off mid-word, laughter dying in throats, the whole space holding its breath as every head turned toward the source of that voice. And there, standing at the entrance with late afternoon sunlight streaming behind him like a cloak made of gold, was a man who commanded attention the way gravity commands falling water, inevitably, completely, without question. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame filling the doorway with a presence that seemed to expand beyond his physical body. His suit was tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been sewn onto him by masters who understood that clothing could be armor, that fabric could convey power, that the right cut could turn a man into a monument. The suit was midnight blue, so dark it was almost black, with subtle pinstripes that caught the light when he moved. His shirt was crisp white, his tie a deep burgundy that suggested both sophistication and controlled passion. But it wasn't the clothes that made people stare. It was the bearing, the way he held himself, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never had to prove his worth, because it was simply understood. His face was strong and handsome, in a way that spoke of good genes and better living, his jaw defined, his cheekbones high, his skin the rich deep brown that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. But it was his eyes that held everyone captive, dark and intense, and currently blazing with barely controlled fury, as they locked onto the manager's hand, still tangled in Amara's hair. The manager's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious, color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken dam, his mouth falling open in a perfect circle of shock, his eyes going wide with the dawning realization that he had made a catastrophic mistake. His hand released Amara's hair so quickly it was as if her hair had suddenly become fire, and he stumbled backward, nearly falling, his expensive shoes squeaking against the marble, in his haste to put distance between himself and the evidence of his cruelty. The man in the doorway, Kofi Adeyemi, though most in the lobby had not yet connected the face to the name that appeared on business pages and society columns, the name that was synonymous with wealth and power and influence that stretched across continents, moved forward with measured steps that somehow covered the distance faster than seemed possible. People parted before him without conscious thought, creating a path as natural as water flowing around stone, their bodies responding to an authority they felt rather than understood. He walked past women in designer gowns who suddenly felt underdressed, past men in expensive suits who suddenly felt inadequate, past security guards who suddenly questioned whether they were on the right side of this confrontation. His focus never wavered from the manager, his gaze as focused and unyielding as a predator who'd marked its prey. When he stopped 3 feet from the man who'd dared to touch his wife, the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 10 degrees, despite the perfect climate control. "I said," Kofi repeated, his voice somehow even more dangerous in its quietness, "remove your hand from my wife." Though the manager had already released her, the words served a different purpose now. They were a statement, a declaration, a line being drawn in marble and gold that everyone present would remember. Amara stood frozen in place, her hand rising unconsciously to touch her hair where the manager's grip had been, her mind struggling to process the sudden shift from humiliation to salvation. She looked at Kofi and saw in his face a combination of emotions that made her heart clench: fury at what had been done to her, pain that he hadn't been there to prevent it, and underneath it all, a fierce protective love that radiated from him to you like heat from a fire. Their eyes met across the small distance, and in that moment, the entire lobby, with all its luxury and all its watching eyes and all its recorded phones, seemed to disappear, collapsing down to just the two of them, just this moment, just the recognition that whatever happened next, they were in it together. "Are you hurt?" Kofi asked. And though his voice was meant only for her, the silence was so complete that everyone heard. She shook her head, not trusting her voice, not yet ready to speak, because speaking would make this real, would acknowledge that this had actually happened, that she had actually been grabbed and humiliated in public, while people watched and did nothing. Kofi's jaw tightened as he read everything she couldn't say in her expression, and then he turned his attention back to the manager, who stood trembling, his face now a sickly gray color that suggested he might actually be physically ill from fear. "Mr. Adeyemi," the manager stammered, the name coming out in pieces. I couldn't have, there was a misunderstanding." His hands fluttered uselessly in the air between them, as if he could somehow gesture away what he'd done, could physically erase the memory of his fingers in her hair, his voice calling her, "people like you," his assumption that she had no right to exist in this space. Kofi let the manager's stammering fill the silence for a long moment, let him dig himself deeper with every word, let everyone watching understand that there would be no easy escape from this. "A misunderstanding," Kofi finally repeated, his tone making the words sound absurd, making it clear that what had happened was not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act of cruelty born from prejudice and assumption. "You put your hands on a woman who had every right to be here. You humiliated her in public. You called security to remove her like she was an intruder when she had a reservation. That's not a misunderstanding. That's assault." The word fell like a hammer, and the manager flinched as if he'd been physically struck. Around them, so the crowd shifted uncomfortably, phones still recording, but now capturing something different. Not a woman being removed, but a man being held accountable. "Sir, please," The manager tried again, his voice cracking. "I didn't know she was your wife." But Kofi cut him off with a raised hand, the gesture so commanding that the manager's words died in his throat. "That's the problem," Kofi said, and his voice rose slightly now, allowing the anger he'd been controlling to color his words. "You're apologizing because she's connected to me. Because she's my wife. As if that's the only reason she deserves respect. As if that's the only reason she has value. But what if she wasn't my wife? What if she was just a woman with a reservation, trying to check into a hotel? Would that have made it acceptable to grab her? To humiliate her? To judge her worth based on her clothes?" The questions hung in the air, unanswerable, because they all knew the truth. The manager had looked at Amara and seen someone he could treat with contempt because she lacked the visible markers of wealth and status that would have protected her. The manager opened his mouth and closed it several times, looking like a fish pulled from water, desperate for air, but finding none. His eyes darted around the lobby as if searching for help, for someone to intervene, for some escape from the judgment he felt bearing down on him from all sides. But the crowd that had gathered offered no rescue. They were witnesses now, their phones recording evidence, their silence a tacit acknowledgement that they had watched this happen and done nothing. Some faces showed shame, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in a culture that allowed people to be judged and dismissed based on appearance. Others showed righteous indignation, suddenly aligned with the winning side, suddenly defenders of justice, though moments before they'd watched a woman being assaulted without comment. The security guards who'd been approaching to remove Amara now stood uncertain, reading the shift in power dynamics, understanding that whatever orders they'd been about to follow would now mark them as villains in a story that was rapidly being written. "I want you to think very carefully," Kofi continued, his voice dropping back to that dangerous quiet, "about what exactly made you believe my wife didn't belong in this hotel. Because from where I'm standing, looking at a man who makes his living serving the public in a building he doesn't own, judging a woman based solely on her appearance, I'm seeing someone who understands neither dignity nor respect." Each word was chosen with precision, designed to cut, to expose, to force acknowledgement of a truth the manager had probably never examined in himself. The air in the lobby felt thick now, charged with the electricity that comes before a storm, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something significant, not just a confrontation, but a reckoning. Then, a new voice cut through the tension, and this voice was familiar in the worst way, sharp and amused, carrying the particular cruelty that comes from those who've never had to fight for their place in the world. I think we all know what he thought. Heads turned to see Zara Adeyemi emerging from the crowd, like a queen taking the stage, her entrance calculated for maximum effect. She wore a gown that probably cost more than most people earned in 6 months. Deep crimson silk that clung to her frame before flowing around her legs, like liquid fire. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists and ears, catching the chandelier light and throwing it back in sharp sparks. Her makeup was flawless, her hair swept up in an elaborate style that had probably required hours and a team of professionals. She was stunning in the way that money makes possible when combined with good genes and better trainers and the best of everything since birth. But there was something cold in her beauty, something calculating in the way she smiled as she positioned herself beside the still trembling manager. "Poor man," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy that everyone recognized as mockery. "How were you supposed to know? I mean, look at her." She gestured toward Amara with one hand, the movement somehow conveying more disdain than words ever could, as if she were pointing out a stain on expensive fabric or a crack in fine china. Can you really blame him for assuming she was, well, you know? She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to, because the implication was clear enough to everyone present. Kofi's expression, which had been controlled fury directed at the manager, now transformed into something colder and more personal as he turned to face his sister. "Zara," he said, her name coming out as a warning, as a line she shouldn't cross, as a brother giving one last chance for family loyalty to overcome cruelty. "Don't." But Zara had never been good at reading warnings, or perhaps she simply didn't care, drunk on the attention and the opportunity to say publicly what she'd been saying privately for months. "I'm just being honest, Kofi," she said, her voice rising with indignation, as if she were the victim here, as if truth-telling justified cruelty. "If you're going to marry someone from her background, maybe give hotels a heads up. Put her name on file with a description, so staff know she's not." She paused, seeming to search for a word that wouldn't sound too harsh, too revealing of her actual thoughts. "So, staff know she's approved to be here." The words landed like grenades, their impact spreading outward in waves of shock and discomfort. This was no longer just about a manager making a mistake. This was about family, about class, about the unspoken hierarchies that divided people into those who belonged and those who didn't. Amara felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one confirming what she'd feared since the moment she'd married into the Adeyemi family. That she would never be enough, never be accepted, never be seen as anything other than an outsider who'd somehow tricked her way in. The lobby seemed to tilt around her, the golden light suddenly too bright, the air suddenly too thin, and she wondered if it was possible to simply disappear through force of will alone. But before she could fully surrender to the shame trying to drown her, before Kofi could respond to his sister's cruelty, another voice entered the conversation, this one carrying an authority that made even Zara pause. "That's enough." The words were not loud, but they cut through the lobby like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. The crowd parted once more, and this time it was for Mr. Adeyemi himself, the patriarch of the family, a man whose name appeared on buildings and in financial reports, and in the kind of conversations that shaped economies. Mr. Adeyemi moved through the lobby with the bearing of someone who'd built empires from nothing, who'd clawed his way up from poverty to become one of the wealthiest men on the continent, who understood power not as something inherited, but as something earned and maintained through will and intelligence, and the ability to make hard decisions without flinching. He was in his 60s, but looked younger, his hair silver at the temples, but still thick, his frame still strong beneath an impeccably tailored suit that spoke of quiet wealth rather than flashy display. His face was carved with lines that told stories of late nights and hard negotiations and decades of carrying the weight of responsibility for thousands of employees and their families. Behind him walked Lady Adeyemi, Kofi's mother, elegant in a way that seemed effortless, but Amara had learned was the result of decades of careful cultivation. Every gesture practiced, every expression controlled, every word chosen for maximum effect. She wore a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than a car, pearls at her throat that had been in the family for generations, and an expression that was completely unreadable as she took in the scene before her. Mr. Adeyemi stopped beside his son, his eyes moving methodically from the manager to Zara to Amara, assessing the situation with the speed of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading rooms and people and power dynamics. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades and decisions and the kind of authority that comes from having built everything you have. "Explain," he said simply, the single word directed at the manager, who looked like he might actually faint from the combined stress of being caught in his mistake and now having to answer to the man who ultimately controlled his employment and his future. The manager stammered through his version of events, his story, a carefully constructed mixture of truth and distortion, designed to minimize his culpability while justifying his actions. He spoke of a woman entering the hotel who didn't match the typical profile of their guests, who seemed confused about where she should be, who he approached out of concern for maintaining the hotel's standards and reputation. He mentioned that she became defensive when he asked questions, that there was some confusion about whether she actually had a reservation, that he was simply trying to maintain order and security as his job required. He didn't mention grabbing her hair. That detail was conveniently absent from his narrative, as if dozens of phones hadn't captured the moment, as if the evidence wasn't already spreading across social media in real time. He painted himself as a conscientious employee doing his duty, perhaps a bit overzealous, but ultimately motivated by protection of the hotel's interests and guests. When he finished, the silence that followed was heavy with disbelief that he'd thought this version would be accepted, that he could rewrite reality when so many people had witnessed the truth. Mr. Adeyemi let the silence stretch until the manager began to sweat, visible beads forming on his forehead and upper lip, his expensive shirt collar suddenly looking too tight. Then the patriarch turned to Amara, his expression neutral, his voice carrying no judgment yet, but simply seeking information. "Is this accurate?" he asked. And something about the way he asked, without presumption, without dismissal, simply requesting her truth, made Amara's throat tighten with emotion, because it was the first time since entering this lobby that someone in authority had asked for her version, had treated her testimony as valuable, had given her voice weight. She took a breath, steadying herself, feeling Kofi's presence beside her, like an anchor keeping her grounded. "No, sir," Amara said, her voice quiet at first, but gaining strength as she continued. "I had a reservation. I showed him my phone with the confirmation. He didn't ask me questions. He told me I didn't belong here. He told me this hotel was for paying guests, for people not like me. When I tried to explain, he grabbed my hair and called security to remove me." Each word came out clear and steady, despite the trembling in her hands, despite the shame still burning in her chest, because something about finally being heard gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. Before Mr. Adeyemi could respond, Zara's voice cut in again, sharp with disbelief and indignation. "She's lying," Zara said, her voice rising with emotion that seemed genuine even if it was misdirected. "Obviously she's lying. She's trying to make us look bad, because she knows she doesn't fit here. This is embarrassing for all of us. Can't you see that? Can't you see what she's doing?" There was something desperate in Zara's words now, as if she understood that this moment was somehow pivotal, that whatever happened next would establish precedents and boundaries that would affect her place in the family hierarchy. Her beauty, which moments before had seemed so commanding, now looked brittle, like expensive china on the verge of shattering. "Zara?" Mr. Adeyemi didn't raise his voice, didn't inject any particular emotion into the single word, but the effect was immediate and absolute. His daughter fell silent, as if he'd physically covered her mouth. There was something in his tone that suggested this was not a request, but a command, that he would not repeat himself, that she had already pushed past boundaries he'd been willing to tolerate, and any further speech would have consequences she wouldn't want to face. Mr. Adeyemi turned to his son, and in that look passed something complex, a question, a challenge, a test of loyalty and judgment. "Kofi?" The name was both question and prompt, asking without words whose version his son believed, what his son valued. where his son's ultimate loyalty resided. This was not just about Amara or the manager, or even Zara. This was about the kind of man Kofi was, the kind of leader he would become, the values he would carry forward into the next generation of the family. Kofi didn't hesitate, didn't look away from his father's gaze, didn't qualify or soften his response. "I believe my wife," he said simply, the words clear and absolute, without question, without reservation, without doubt. And in those words was everything. A statement of love, yes, but also a statement of character, a declaration that his marriage was not some rebellion or phase, but a genuine partnership built on trust and respect. Something flickered in Mr. Adeyemi's eyes. Approval, perhaps, or recognition, or the satisfaction of seeing his son become the man he'd hoped to raise. He nodded slowly once, a gesture that seemed to communicate volumes without words. Then he turned back to the manager, and his expression hardened into something that made the man visibly shrink back. "You're fired," Mr. Adeyemi said calmly, with no more emotion than he might use to order coffee or comment on weather. "Security will escort you out. You have 1 hour to clear your office. Severance will be determined by our legal team, based on how quietly you leave and whether any of this situation ends up in court." The words were delivered with such casual finality that it took a moment for everyone to process what had just happened, that a man's career had just ended, that years of employment had just been terminated, that consequences had arrived swift and absolute. The manager's mouth fell open, his face cycling through expressions of shock and disbelief and dawning horror as he realized this was actually happening, that there would be no second chance, no opportunity to explain or apologize his way back into employment. "But, Mr. Adeyemi, this is the hotel. I've worked here for 15 years. His voice rose with each phrase, panic making him lose the professional composure how he'd maintained even while grabbing a woman's hair. "I own this hotel," Mr. Adeyemi said, and the simple statement landed with the force of revelation for those in the crowd who hadn't made the connection, who hadn't realized that the Grand Meridian wasn't just a hotel the Adeyemi family patronized, but property they owned. "I own this entire chain, 43 hotels, across 12 countries, and I will not employ someone who assaults women and then lies about it. I will not have my family's name associated with the kind of prejudice and cruelty you demonstrated today. Leave now." The security guards who'd been called to remove Amara now moved toward the manager instead, the irony not lost on anyone present. They approached him with professional courtesy but firm intention, making clear that this was not negotiable, that resistance would only make things worse. The manager went with them without further protest, his face a mask of devastation, his career and reputation destroyed in the space of minutes because he'd made assumptions about a woman in a simple dress. The crowd watched him go with mixed expressions, some sympathetic, others satisfied, all of them aware they'd witnessed something significant. But the drama was not finished, because Zara had not yet learned the lesson her father was teaching. "This is ridiculous." Her voice rang out across the lobby, high and sharp with indignation that seemed to genuinely confuse her, as if she couldn't understand why everyone wasn't agreeing with her obvious truth. "You're going to destroy a man's career over her?" Zara continued, gesturing toward Amara with unconcealed contempt. "Because Kofi got offended that someone saw through his little charity project? Because someone had the honesty to say what we're all thinking?" She was shaking now, whether from anger or fear or some combination of both. Her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal something raw and ugly underneath. "We all know what this is. Kofi's rebellion, his way of proving he's different from us, that he's not defined by wealth and status like the rest of us, but he is. He's an Adeyemi. And one day he's going to wake up and realize he married someone who can't even walk into a hotel without being mistaken for. The slap echoed through the lobby like a gunshot, sharp and sudden and shocking in its violence. Everyone froze, the sound seeming to reverberate off the marble and crystal, bouncing back at them from every surface. Zara stood with her hand pressed to her cheek, her mouth open in an perfect circle of shock, her eyes wide and disbelieving as she stared at the woman who'd struck her. Lady Adeyemi stood with her hand still raised, her chest rising and falling rapidly with emotion that had finally broken through her carefully maintained control. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with tears she was fighting to contain. And for the first time since Amara had met her, she looked fully human, not a society matron or a wealthy wife or a carefully constructed persona, but a mother and a woman who had reached the absolute limit of what she could tolerate. "You will not," Lady Adeyemi said, her voice shaking but fierce, each word pushed out with effort. "Disrespect your brother's wife. You will not disgrace this family with your cruelty. You will not stand in this lobby and confirm every terrible assumption that manager made by suggesting that your sister-in-law is less than human, less than worthy, less than deserving of basic respect." Lady Adeyemi took a breath, seeming to gather herself, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but no less intense. "And you will not project your own insecurities, your jealousy, that your brother found real love while you collect men like accessories, your resentment that he's happy while you're perpetually unsatisfied, your fear that his happiness somehow diminishes your importance, onto a woman whose only crime is being loved by someone you wish loved you more." The words were brutal in their honesty, cutting through pretense and social niceties to expose truths that had probably never been spoken aloud in the family. Zara's eyes filled with tears that might have been from the slap, or from the words, or from the sudden shocking exposure of feelings she'd perhaps never fully acknowledged even to herself. Her face crumpled, her beauty collapsing into something that looked young and hurt and lost. Without another word, she turned and fled, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble, in a staccato rhythm that gradually faded as she disappeared into the depths of the hotel, leaving only silence and shock in her wake. Lady Adeyemi watched her daughter go, and something in her expression suggested this had been building for longer than just today, that she'd been watching Zara spiral into cruelty and had finally reached the point where maternal protection had to give way to correction. She stood very still for a moment, her hand slowly lowering to her side, her breathing gradually returning to normal as she regained the composure that was her armor and her survival strategy. Then she turned to Amara, and her expression was complex, regret and recognition, and something that might have been the very beginning of respect, struggling through years of prejudice and fear. "I owe you an apology," Lady Adeyemi said, quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness, because everyone in the lobby was straining to hear. "Several apologies, actually," Lady Adeyemi continued, her words coming slowly, as if each one cost her something. "I have watched my daughter treat you with contempt for months and said nothing. I have made excuses for her behavior, told myself she needed time to adjust, convinced myself that staying silent was somehow kinder than confrontation. I have allowed my own fears about losing my son to someone I didn't choose, about our family's image and reputation, about change and what it means, to justify cruelty. I was wrong." She paused, and Amara could see the effort it took for this woman, who'd probably never apologized to anyone beneath her social station in her entire life, to admit fault publicly. I know you may not believe this, Lady Adeyemi said, and you have no reason to trust me given how I've treated you. But I was you once, a lifetime ago, before I learned to wear pearls and speak in modulated tones and hold my face just so. I grew up in a village, not entirely unlike yours, small, poor, where we worked the land and shared what little we had. When I married into this family, when I became Lady Adeyemi, I was told every single day, in 1,000 different ways, that I wasn't enough, that I didn't belong, that I was an embarrassment they were trying to train into acceptability. Her voice dropped lower, more intimate, as if she were sharing secrets she'd kept buried for decades. I had to change everything about myself. My accent, which was too rural, too uneducated. My manners, which were too rough, too honest. My clothes, which were too simple, too revealing of my origins. Even the way I walked, which apparently broadcast my background with every step. I learned to speak differently, laugh differently, exist differently, until the woman I'd been was buried so deep I sometimes couldn't remember her face. Tears stood in her eyes now, not falling but present, evidence of pain long suppressed. And somewhere in that transformation, I convinced myself it was necessary, that the cruelty was love, that forcing someone to change everything about themselves was actually protection, preparation for a world that wouldn't accept them otherwise. Lady Adeyemi took a step closer to Amara, her voice gaining strength, even as it remained soft. I see now that I was wrong. I was passing on the same trauma that was inflicted on me, perpetuating a cycle of cruelty disguised as education. When I saw you and Kofi together, I saw myself and Mr. Adeyemi 40 years ago, the village girl and the rising businessman, love blooming in spaces it supposedly didn't belong. But instead of protecting you from what I went through, instead of standing between you and the cruelty I knew was coming, I convinced myself that Kofi needed to marry someone who already fit, someone who wouldn't need to be broken down and rebuilt. I told myself I was protecting my son, but really I was protecting myself from having to face what I'd become. She reached out, as if to touch Amara's hand, then seemed to think better of it, letting her own hand fall back to her side. You stood in this lobby today and faced humiliation with more dignity than I've shown in 40 years of careful performance. You didn't change who you are to make other people comfortable. You didn't pretend to be something you're not. And that strength, that absolute refusal to be diminished, is what my son saw in you. It's what I should have seen. It's what I was too afraid to acknowledge, because it reminded me of everything I'd sacrificed to fit into this world. Her voice cracked slightly, the careful control slipping. So, I apologize, not just for today, though certainly for today, but for every moment I made you feel unwelcome in your own family, for every time I chose comfort over courage, for every time I saw my daughter being cruel and told myself it wasn't my place to intervene. I apologize, and I don't expect forgiveness because I'm not sure I deserve it. But I needed you to know. You belong here, not because you married Kofi, though that's reason enough, but because you're exactly the kind of strength this family needs. Amara stood silent for a long moment, processing words she'd never expected to hear, feeling the careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack. This was the woman who'd made her feel small for months, who'd stood by while Zara launched attack after attack, who'd embodied everything Amara feared about never being accepted. But there was something in Lady Adeyemi's eyes now. Genuine remorse, painful self-awareness, the kind of honesty that costs something to reveal. Amara understood in that moment that hurt people, that Lady Adeyemi's cruelty had been armor against her own unhealed wounds that this apology was not just words, but a woman finally acknowledging truths she'd spent decades avoiding. "Thank you," Amara said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion flooding through her. "I don't know if I can forget everything that's happened. I don't know if trust can be rebuilt that quickly, but I appreciate your honesty, and I understand now what I couldn't say before, that you weren't just judging me, you were fighting ghosts of your own past." Lady Adeyemi's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she nodded once, accepting the measured response as more than she deserved. Mr. Adeyemi, who had been watching this exchange with an expression of deep contemplation, stepped forward and placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, a gesture of support, of solidarity, perhaps of his own acknowledgement that he'd allowed certain dynamics to persist that shouldn't have. Then he turned to Amara with an expression that held something new, something she hadn't seen from him before. Not just acceptance, but genuine respect. "You have a reservation here, I believe," he said, his voice warm in a way it hadn't been in their previous interactions. Amara nodded, still finding her footing in this rapidly shifting landscape. "Then, allow me to personally escort you to the presidential suite, where the family will be preparing for tonight's gala," Mr. Adeyemi continued, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy that somehow felt genuine rather than performative. "If you'll permit me." Amara looked at Kofi, whose expression was a mixture of pride and relief and love so powerful it seemed to radiate from him like light. He nodded encouragingly, and Amara turned back to Mr. Adeyemi and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the expensive fabric of his suit beneath her fingers. Together they walked through the lobby, past the guests who'd watched her humiliation, past the phones that had recorded her shame, past the space where she'd stood with a man's hand in her hair, feeling smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. But this time everything was different. This time, she walked on the arm of one of the most powerful men in the country, his presence beside her, a declaration that she belonged, that she was family, that anyone who doubted it would answer to him. The crowd parted before them with a deference that felt almost comical, given how they'd watched her being assaulted minutes earlier. And Amara understood something profound about power and perception. That people didn't see truth, they saw context, and context was determined by association, and symbols, and the invisible hierarchies that governed social spaces. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, but not uncomfortable. Mr. Adeyemi seemed lost in thought, his expression contemplative, and Amara simply tried to process everything that had happened in the last 30 minutes. The attack, the humiliation, Kofi's arrival, the confrontation, Zara's cruelty, Lady Adeyemi's apology, and now this strange peace that felt fragile and new and uncertain. When the elevator doors opened onto a private hallway carpeted in deep burgundy, Mr. Adeyemi led her to ornate double doors at the end. He produced a key card and opened them onto the most beautiful space Amara had ever seen. The presidential suite was more than a hotel room. It was a residence, a palace, a place where presidents and celebrities and royalty stayed when they visited the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city spread out below like a kingdom of glass and light. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings, painted with elaborate frescoes that looked like they belonged in European palaces. Furniture that could only be described as art-filled rooms, larger than her entire childhood home. Sofas upholstered in silk, tables carved from rare woods, chairs that looked too beautiful to actually sit in. But what made Amara's breath catch, what brought tears she'd been fighting all day, finally spilling down her cheeks, wasn't the luxury or the beauty or the obvious wealth displayed in every surface and object. It was the wall of photographs in the suite's main sitting room. The Adeyemi family history, captured in frames of gold and silver, a visual timeline of the family's journey from modest beginnings to continental prominence. There was Mr. Adeyemi as a young man, perhaps 25, standing proudly in front of a tiny shop with a hand-painted sign. The first business, the seed from which the empire grew. There was Lady Adeyemi on their wedding day, young and radiant and nervous in a simple white dress that cost nothing like what she wore now. Her smile genuine and full of hope for the future they'd build together. There were photos of Kofi, and Zara, as children, gap-toothed and innocent, playing in yards that got progressively larger and more manicured as the family's fortune grew. Photos of business openings and award ceremonies and milestone moments that marked the family's rise. And there, in a newer section that looked recently added, were photos of Kofi and Amara, their small wedding ceremony, with just close friends, intimate and beautiful in its simplicity. Amara laughing at something Kofi had whispered, her head thrown back in pure joy, his eyes on her like she was the only person in the world. The two of them at their university graduation, her in cap and gown, him watching her receive her diploma with visible pride. Candid shots of them cooking together in their small apartment, walking through markets, existing in the comfortable intimacy of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Someone had been documenting their life together, adding them to the family narrative, treating their love story as part of the larger Adeyemi legacy. "I had those hung yesterday," Mr. Adeyemi said quietly, coming to stand beside her as she stared at the photographs through blurred vision. "I should have done it months ago," he continued, his voice carrying notes of regret. "Should have made it clear, from the moment you married my son, that you're a family. Not a guest, not a visitor, not someone on trial or probation. Family. Full stop. No qualifications." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I have made many mistakes in my life, Amara. Built companies on risky bets that could have destroyed everything. Made decisions that hurt people even when I thought I was helping them. But one thing I've learned over decades in businesses and life is that you judge people not by their polish, but by their character. Not by where they come from, but by where they're going. Not by what they have, but by what they give." He turned to look at her directly, his expression open, in a way she'd never seen from him. "Watching my son defend you downstairs, seeing the man he became in that moment, fierce and protective and absolutely certain about his values, I saw the man I raised him to be. The man who stands up for what's right, regardless of cost or convenience. The man who values character over status, substance over appearance, love over strategy. And he learned those values partly from me, yes, but he learned how to live them from you." Amara wiped at her tears, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal, by acceptance coming from a source she'd given up on. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why now? What changed?" Mr. Adeyemi smiled, and it transformed his stern features into something warm and almost paternal. "You want the truth? What changed was watching you stand in that lobby, with dignity intact, despite everything being done to strip it away. Watching you face humiliation, without becoming small, without apologizing for existing, without pretending to be something you're not just to make other people comfortable. That takes a kind of strength that can't be taught or bought. It's forged through difficulty and maintained through choice. And that's when I realized, you don't need to change to fit into this family. This family needs to change to deserve you." The door opened and Kofi entered, slightly breathless, his eyes immediately finding Amara and scanning her face with concern. "Is everything okay? Did something else happen?" He crossed the room quickly, naturally moving to her side, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "Everything is fine," Mr. Adeyemi said, his tone carrying a warmth that seemed to surprise even Kofi. "Better than fine. I was just telling your wife that she's made this family better simply by being part of it, and that tonight at the gala, we'll be making that abundantly clear to everyone who matters." He moved toward the door, pausing before leaving. "There are stylists and assistants standing by, if you'd like help preparing for tonight, Amara. Though something tells me you could walk into that ballroom in the dress you're wearing and outshine everyone there, not because of clothes or jewelry, but because you carry something most people in that room have never had: genuine dignity." He left, closing the door softly, and suddenly Amara and Kofi were alone in the beautiful suite, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, the city spread out below them like a promise. Kofi pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she felt the tension she'd been carrying finally begin to release. "I'm so sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I should have been there. Should have protected you from ever experiencing something like that." Amara pulled back enough to look at his face, seeing the guilt and pain there. "You did protect me," she said firmly. "Every single day since we met, you've protected me. Not by shielding me from the world, but by standing beside me in it, by believing in me when others doubted, by choosing me again and again when it would have been easier to choose your family's approval. That's more than I ever dreamed of having." Kofi cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tear tracks on her cheeks. "I love you," he said. The words simple but weighted with everything, with promise and commitment, and the certainty that comes from truly knowing someone. "I love you too," Amara whispered. And in that moment, standing in a suite that cost more per night than her mother earned in months, surrounded by luxury that still felt foreign and overwhelming, she finally understood something profound. Belonging isn't something granted by others or earned through transformation or achieved by accumulating the right symbols and markers. Belonging is something you claim for yourself by refusing to be diminished, by standing in your truth even when it's uncomfortable, by loving and being loved without apology or shame. The gala that evening was magnificent in ways that would be talked about for months. The ballroom transformed into something from a dream. 500 of the city's most powerful and wealthy people gathered under chandeliers that cost more than homes, champagne flowing like water, a symphony orchestra playing music that seemed to make the very air shimmer. And in the center of it all, Amara walked in on Kofi's arm, wearing an emerald gown that Lady Adeyemi had personally selected, elegant and stunning, without erasing who she was. She still wore her grandmother's copper bracelet on her wrist, visible against the expensive fabric, a reminder and a declaration. When Mr. Adeyemi took the stage midway through the evening to give his annual address, he spoke about legacy and family and the values that truly matter. And then he called Kofi and Amara to join him, introducing them not as his son and daughter-in-law, but as the future of the family, as examples of what the Adeyemi name should represent: strength of character, courage to stand against injustice, love that transcends boundaries others try to enforce. The applause was thunderous, and as Amara stood on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, she saw some who'd been in that lobby, who'd watched her humiliation and done nothing. But she also saw respect now, where there had been contempt, recognition where there had been dismissal. And she understood that while the world might judge by appearance and wealth and status, the people who truly matter judge by different measures entirely. In the end, she learned that love built on truth, protected by courage, and lived with dignity is indeed the greatest treasure of all. More valuable than gold, more lasting than fame, more powerful than any empire built on lesser foundations.